running series of what we have called the Nantucket Perspective with the Nantucket Athenaeum. Tonight, we have the Town of Nantucket's Natural Resource Department, Vince Murphy. He is our island's Coastal Resiliency Coordinator. Now, I want to go over a couple of things. If you've noticed, there's some different features than what you're used to with having normally used Zoom. This is the webinar version. And so to go over a couple of things, we do ask that you take all subject questions to the Q&A feature there at the bottom of your screen. That will queue your questions for us to answer at the end of the session. All immediate questions, whether it be IT, audio, video, I should say you will not have a video feature for the webinar version, only audio, which will mute and unmute yourself. So if that's what you're seeing, don't worry, that's normal. But any immediate questions, throw them there in that chat button as opposed to the Q&A button that we're going to save for subject matters. And again, we'll answer those towards the end of the session. And we're going to run about an hour, about 8 o'clock. And I would say about 7:45, we'll try to open it up for a Q&A. And so with that said, I'm going to open it up to Vince here and we'll get going. Vince, if you could just introduce yourself to the audience and a little bit about yourself, and we'll get going.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Vince Murphy, as Daniel already pointed out, Natural Resources Department. I'm the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, effectively trying to look after erosion and flooding around the island, amongst many other issues. As you might imagine from my accent, I am not local. To use the local parlance, I'm a very definite wash ashore. Arrived in Nantucket about 4.5–5 years ago. Originally from Cork in the south of Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. Lived most of my life in Cork up until about 22, 23. Had, up to that stage, I just had a huge interest in wildlife in particular. I wanted to be an ecologist and did that for many years. I ended up leaving one profession to take on another. Once I finished the Irish version of high school, I ended up training and becoming a chef. Decided I didn't like working indoors anymore. So I decided I wanted to work outdoors. And this was my first big move. I moved to England, UK. And then I was in Winchester, a city called Winchester. And then I studied wildlife management and conservation biology. It was a 3-year condensed course. It was 4 years worth of material put into 3 years. We didn't get summers or much vacation time and just had to power through. It was a fast learning course. Finished that, did that from 2003 to 2007, finished into a financial crisis. And then in January of 2008, I started a master's program, and this was one of the most interesting things I've ever done. In the master's program, it was called Ecosystem Management and Ecosystem Conservation and Landscape Management. It was a group of 9 students in a partially taught master's, where we traveled to 4 different universities in 3 different countries. We started in my hometown, but those people from all over, including some Americans, on that course, one of whom I married. Everybody might, well, some people might know Emily Goldstein. She's obviously here with me, in 2 rooms over. And then that course started in UCC, in University College Cork, went from there to the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. We also did a course in the University of Wageningen, in the center of the Netherlands. Got to see the Dutch system, look at how they do landscape management, how they deal with conservation, how they specifically deal with water management below sea level, and their systems of polders, which are field systems that can be flooded at any stage, and all the dikes that keep the most of the country dry, and the massive Zider Z levee system that keeps all of the country drive from the North Sea. Then from there, we ended up going to University of Helsinki in Finland. Spent just shy of 6 months there. We got there, what was it, August, that kind of time, and we were there through December. So got to experience a northern winter. Also while working with one of the best ecologists in the world, a guy called Dr. Ilka Hansky, who sadly died about 5 years ago. But one of the best ecologists and one of the fathers of a type of population analysis called metapopulations. He's well known for his butterfly work. The last quarter of that course went back to Ireland, to the West Coast, where we did, we're in National University of Ireland, Galway, finished our thought work there, and then we entered a 5-month research phase. The research phase was one of the more interesting things I've ever done. I was working on a project where we were tracking reintroduced white-tailed sea eagles from Norway. The Irish government had brought these birds from nests when they're about 3 months old into Ireland, put them in aviaries, reared them up till they were big enough to fly at about 5 months of age, and then released them. And it was my job to track them for 5 months and find out what specific landscape features they were using. Ended up they were using a lot of very tall trees that are big drops, so their wingspans could help them fly more easily. That was finished, that master's course finished in 2009. It was a 2-year master's. And then from there, I got a job as an environmental consultant. I did that for about 7 years. I was working for a small consultancy called Dixon Brosnan Environmental Consultants. Started as an entry level, worked my way up a little bit, and halfway through the consulting work, I ended up starting a PhD. Still doing that PhD, towards the end of it now, thankfully. So eventually I'll have a PhD in applied ecology. It's been going on a couple of years longer than I'd anticipated, but life does have to happen. And one of the things that slowed it down was the fact that myself and my wife had a family. So it is what it is. It will get done.
Well, within that, Vince, sorry to interrupt. Can you bring us into your, from your studies to your transition to Nantucket?
Sure, that's the easy bit. So we ended up in America kind of by accident. My wife is American. She had been with me in Ireland and Europe for about 7-8 years. Then she did her PhD on squirrels, and she got offered a chance to work in one of the best squirrel labs in the world. And she ended up with John Kaprowski, Dr. John Kaprowski. She ended up working with him there, doing her postdoc for a year. And then once that ended, Emily wanted to look for some proper work at that point. And she ended up bringing us to Nantucket because she got a job at the Marine Mitchell Association.
Okay.
So we came here. Shortly thereafter, I was working part-time with the Marine Mitchell Association myself. About a year and a half later, I ended up getting a job with the town. I was the protected species technician working with the plovers on the beach, plovers, catchers, terns, that kind of stuff. And then this job came up. It's perfectly within my field because of my master's work. It deals with landscape elements. It deals with some population stuff. I'm not talking wildlife populations anymore. I'm talking real populations, people, and how natural events affect people. So it's a new field for me in some ways, but it's still quite comfortable for me to be able to work in these things. So that once we come on to coastal resilience and I can start looking at methods for controlling flood or lessening the impact of flood, or likewise for erosion, controlling or lessening the impact of erosion. These are things that I have worked on many cases, part of my master's work, as part of my consulting work in the past, and is just a different place, but very familiar ground for me.
Well, great. And so with that, let's just segue to why we're all here with coastal resilience. And now, and we might be taking a step back a bit here. You touched on it there at the end. once you accepted the position as the Coastal Resilience Coordinator and you kind of started ingratiating yourself with the position and the job duties and what would be expected, what, if you could just talk to the audience a little bit about sort of why the position was more or less created in the first place, the kind of the need, that need and the initiative surrounding that need.
Yeah.
Just kind of a broad approach to that.
Well, there's been kind of an underground movement calling for someone to do this kind of work for a long time. But where it really came from is there was an MVP, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness. It's a state-run program. And one of the key things that came from that, which was held in April of 2019 by the consultants Malone and McBroom, here on Ireland, was the community give all their input, they say what they're concerned about, and one of the key things that came from that was they said that we need someone to deal with all these coastal issues. So the consultants ended up recommending as a key priority that a Coastal Resilience Coordinator position be created. That wasn't all they did. They also recommended that there should be an advisory group, the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee. So together with them, the great big arching overview is that the Coastal Resilience Coordinator and the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee work together to develop a coastal resilience plan for the town, develop it and implement it.
Okay. Well, great. So I'm sure with the audience, and to keep it light and keep it moving, and so now that you're in this position, and we all know that coastal resiliency, being an island, is of importance, and it can be a very topical conversation amongst the community. As what would you say your first 100 days have been in terms of moving forward in the position?
Okay, so I started this job in the end of July, 29th of July, 2019. So the better part of 9 or 10 months into it now.
Okay.
So I won't necessarily go for the 100 days. I'll just give you an overview of what happened in that time frame.
Okay, great.
So one of the main hurdles for me to come to terms with was the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee and trying to understand their directive from the select board and then work with their directive and all the members on it. By the way, I'd just like to take a minute to say hello to all of the committee members and name them out and just say thank you for all of their time and everything they've done. We have Mary Longacre, who's the chair of the committee. Jen Carberg from, just to say, we have 6 appointed members and 3 at-large members for a committee of 9. So we have Mary Longacre, who's the chair, Jen Carberg, who works with NCF, she's their appointed member, Peter Brace from SHAB, Matt Fee from the Select Board, Gary Beller from the Committee of Non-Voting Taxpayers, Ian Golding from the CONCOM, then Fritz McClure from the Planning Board, and then the last 2 at-large members are Sarah Boyce, Dr. Sarah Boyce, who also works for Linda Loring and is another ecologist and someone who's quite comfortable with a lot of these. And the last person then is Graham Durovich. She's an at-large member, but also must understand that she works for the town separately. She works for the DPW. So this committee has an awful lot of very, hi Mary, very experienced members and people who have a tremendous understanding of the flooding and the erosion that's gone on here. Now, this has been incredibly beneficial to me. I've seen it firsthand, but I've only seen it firsthand for 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
For the most part, have been here their whole lives, know it, tell me all about it, explain it to me in detail. So all I can do at that point is take it in. Then there's other organizations in a similar vein that have given me quite a lot of useful information over time. Must also give a shout out to the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. They've been quite welcoming and have provided very useful information from time to time. So that's just kind of an overview of the committee and the work that we've done. So the first thing we had to do was all come together as a group to try and understand it. So the first kind of 3-4 months up to Christmas, from September to Christmas, we were doing a lot of education. I was doing a lot of presentations to bring everyone up to speed. everyone was understood it, but we had to kind of solidify around one set of understandings. People like Dr. Jen Carberg and Dr. Sarah Boyce had actually worked on an awful lot of programs for the island, educational type things, knew it, worked on a lot of coastal resilience type things, had even worked on the storm tide pathways with others. So they knew what they were talking about. And they helped, and they gave presentations too. We had a lot of internal knowledge we wanted to use. But we had to get everyone on the same page. So that was a lot of what we were doing before Christmas, that and setting goals and things like setting up like the Resilience Library online. I created a library of resources, and I also included some coastal resilience plans from other communities so that we could start modeling ours after that. Then after Christmas, from January to, well, I can only say early March because, well, we're talking online for a reason.
Yep.
The committee started and I started putting together an RFP so that we could hire some consultants. We got one report accepted in January from consultants Malone and McBroom. Again, they provided us with a strategies document. It outlined some risk and some vulnerability. Mm-hmm. The main point of it was to look at what strategies we might be able to use to move forward.
Okay.
So that was a very useful, and it's an early guiding document, but it's not our only one. What we're really looking for is a full coastal resilience plan with actionable items so that we can say, all right, we know there's a problem in an area.
Okay.
What are the potential solutions and how will we implement it? What will it cost? These kind of real world solutions.
Okay, well, based off that, let me shake it up a little bit, and probably why everybody's here. When we hear coastal resiliency, the anxieties, and I'm going to give you the big one, Vince. When you say plan and solutions, I'm going to ask you, are we going to be underwater?
Well, adequate planning will slow it down, but
there you go.
Kind of solutions. I like to think about these in kind of very practical ways. You can come up with a bunch of solutions, but what will work? It's like saying knowledge. Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. What solution should we use in a particular place so that we're not doing the wrong thing? Mm-hmm. That's the way that I look at everything now. So if we look at, say, the downtown area, Easy Street, I pick on Easy Street a lot. There's a flooding there. How are we going to deal with it? So we could build a bigger wall. We could do a lot of stuff in front of the wall. We could put in a wetland system. But what would actually work? It takes a little bit of thought and a bit of modeling to understand what would work in a particular scenario. Likewise, Washington Street. Should we just raise up all of Washington Street so that we could keep everything behind it dry? Well, if we did that, everything behind it, anytime it would rain, would just hold water and not get back out. Mm-hmm. You just have to know that some solutions also have drawbacks.
Okay.
So it might be useful at this point if we were to outline some of the real problems. I've prepared a few slides just to kind of outline the problem. The biggest problem we have as an island community is sea level rise.
Okay.
The numbers attached to sea level rise are really worth sharing for the island. So just sharing a screen here for everyone to see. I hope everyone can see it fully. This is just some really basic information. Don't take much from it. All we need to know is that in 1965, NOAA attached a tide gauge to Steamship Wharf. That's been sitting there for 54 years collecting data. We know the height of every tide from then to now. Every month's worth of tide was brought to a mean, every annual tide was brought to a mean, and that's what we're looking at here, just average tide heights per year. And there's only one way to put it, it's going up. So we
for the novice, so what the basic novice can take from this graph is that we are indeed going up.
We're indeed going up, numbers are showing it, but what the numbers are is also very worthwhile knowing. We know that over the last 100 years through modeling, the sea level has risen by 14 inches. That's inaccurate, actually. It's 13.9 for the sake of being nice and open. Let's call it 14. So in 100 years, we've had 14 inches of sea level rise. But in the 54 years since 1965, we've had 8 inches worth of sea level rise. So it's increasing over time. It's accelerating a little. And this is borne out through the data. And it's just something that worries me, because you can break that down. If we know that it's increasing by 14 inches per 100 years, that's kind of abstract. That's kind of outside of everyone's lifetime, and it means very little. You bring it down to per decade, it's 1.4 inches per decade. It gives it more of a real world feel. Then if you think that some of the houses, say, or some of the businesses in the downtown area around Easy Street or Brand Point or Eastern Street, that kind of area, they already have the water table at the moment. In some cases, only about a foot and a half, maybe 2 feet under their house. It floods, water table comes up. It rains a lot, water table comes up.
Okay. Now, I did want to jump in, Vince. Looking at this graph, the points per, as we scale through the years, do represent an up and down variance. Could you speak to the variables at play and why maybe some years there's a drop and some years there's an increase?
I asked a person from NOAA that once and I didn't get a satisfactory answer, so I don't think I can explain that.
Okay.
All I can do is say that we can see that there is variation in the data, but when you put the trend line, the smooth line through the center, it just shows consistently that we've had increase.
Okay.
This is also something else that worries me. Just to move on very quickly, high tide flooding. This is something we've seen more and more, and for a reason. So on the graph on the left, not going to get super technical with this. In the past, from 65 to 90s, there was some high tide flooding, but an awful lot less. From the 90s on, a lot more and increasing. Potentially decreasing in the last few years, but hard to say, because once you get into smaller chunks of time, it's harder to give a reasonable assessment. But the other important thing in this graph, in this image, is the red areas. Those are the areas that are currently subject to high tide flooding. And we've seen it, twice this winter already? Once in March and again in April, in early April. As the Coastal Resilience Coordinator, it's my job to go out and take photographs of these things. So a lot of these areas were pretty damn wet then.
Can you predict when these, I would say maximum high tides, or would you call them king tides, are going to occur?
Some of them are king tides, others are storm event tides. But
okay.
Once we get about 1.77 feet above mean high tide, that's when areas start flooding here in town. So business owners on Easy Street ring me regularly to say, oh, this is coming up. I'm watching the tides myself, but I'll happily take any input from the public or anyone that wants to just text me and tell me. And they tell me when it's there. Sometimes I go down and take a sample, see what the salinity is, or just go and take photographs to understand it. But most of the time, I'm trying to see how bad it is, the impact on buildings and on businesses. What's it doing to roads? What's it doing to, there's a construction site at the moment that the land bank are working on, or have contractors working on rather. And during a flood event, that was 100% covered. And it led to a bit of settlement that, wasn't expecting. Some sediments got onto the road, probably from that site, but it wasn't major. But it's just those kind of things I'm looking for the impact of.
So are you looking at erosion as well?
Yeah, that's a separate matter.
Okay.
We can get onto erosion. We just want to get one or two things out of the way with.
Oh, no, of course.
So just want to show you one quick map of the island, and I'm just going to then focus in from the downtown area. This is kind of me copping out and showing one map instead of showing three. So this is a hurricane inundation map. There's 4 colors on this map. And it kind of goes from light green, which is a category 1 hurricane, dark green category 2, yellow category 3, and red is obviously category 4 hurricane. but this is broadly similar. There are differences, but it's broadly similar to two other maps. One is the Storm Tide Pathways map. It just has more granularity. It's got about, I think, 13 different layers to it. That's why I'm only showing this one with 4 different layers, just to, I know there's differences between them, but it also makes it easier to explain because they're broadly similar areas, not the same. Then another map that's very similar to this is the Fema flood zone map. Again, there are differences, but broadly similar.
So is that, sorry, Vince, to interrupt, is that what this map is showing us? Areas that degree of which impacted by floodwaters during a hurricane?
Correct.
Okay.
So for the most part, we only see category 1s and occasionally a category 2. So we're mostly concerned with light green and dark green areas. Every once in a while, in particularly bad storms or flood events, we might see flooding into a yellow area here for the sake of argument. Storm Tide Pathways maps are slightly different and show a different set of data. It's all on the town GIS website if you want to check the information there. But this just shows, doesn't really matter. If you just take the light green and dark green areas, the areas that are at risk, that's basically all to take from this. And they're the imminent risk, and the light green areas are imminent risk of high tide flooding as well, similarly. But it's just something to be aware of.
Okay.
So then just kind of focus in on the downtown area. Again, most of the emphasis will be on the light green and dark green areas. And when you take that into account, you're looking at some of the most expensive real estate in the island and the state. You've got all the downtown shopping, well, some of the downtown shopping area. You've got Hulbert Avenue, all in there, all Grand Point in there. And those areas do flood regularly. And I have a lot of contact with people in Brant Point, particularly seeing as how my office is in Brant Point, and I have to drive through these floodwaters to get to work. I feel their pain. I know what they're experiencing, and it is terrible, but all we have to do is work for solutions. That's the only thing we can do. We can complain. Complaints must lead to actions that have resolution. So that's just a quick overview of the flooding. I think the next one, yeah, that's on erosion. You were asking about erosion, so I'll just segue into that quite lightly.
Please do, please do.
So this is the other big problem. Flooding is one of the biggest issues, and when we talk about flooding, we can talk about most parts of the island, but people tend to focus on downtown. Partly for examples, but partly for ease of understanding because everyone goes there. When we talk about erosion, the whole island again experiences it, but some of the worst erosion, and one of the organizations, some of the organizations I talk with most about erosion are in Nantucket. We could also talk about other parts of the island, but Nantucket has seen some of the worst erosion. So if you look at the red line there, that goes all the way back to 1844. That's where the coastline was then. And then it regresses backwards constantly. And then you can see the black line, that's the innermost, was a survey done in 2007 and 2009. But we also can see, because this is an aerial photograph, well, it's actually a little bit further back than that in some areas, just in 10 years. But you can just see that it's in constant regression. But just to kind of put some numbers to it, this is a tough graph, and this focuses in just on one specific area with high erosion. And just to give you a bit of a taste of it, I'm going to just get a bit numerical for a second. This is from the state website that looks at erosion. These yellow bars are transects that go down the beach. They're about 160 feet between each bar, or 180 feet between each of these transect bars. And each bar has a number on it. All of the numbers on these ones are negative in the Nantucket area. So what they do is they show a number. It's hard to read, and I'm sorry, but all you got to take from it is most of them show minus 10 feet, minus 11 feet, one or two will show minus 12 feet. That's minus 10 feet per year.
Okay.
But that's not really how erosion works. The way that it works for the most part is a place will be relatively stable for 2-3 years and then lose 30 feet in one event or over a series of events. And then it'll be stable again for a while. But if you're a homeowner 60 feet from the sea, which there are some of, you would be very worried, and I'm worried for them. So
what is that -10 like an annual rate, or what does that represent?
Yes, it is minus 10 feet per year.
Okay.
And each bar has its own number, but that's
Okay.
about an average for this area, minus 10, minus 11.
What would you say would be the most impacted area on the island? Would it be Nantucket or?
Yeah, that's why I'm showing this as an example.
Okay.
If you go out onto Smith's Point, even though there's only 3 houses on Esther's Island, part of Smith's Point, there's 1 or 2 bars there that are minus 12 and minus 13, I think, as far as I remember, off the top of my head. But yeah, this is some of the most erosion on island. But the reason why I'm showing Nantucket in particular is because this is a populated area with that level of erosion. They're also suffering from flooding problems as well, but erosion is a serious issue down there. And plus, Nantucket is, not to play favorites, but I spend a lot of time down there. It's one of my favorite places, particularly Smith's Point, not just for work, but also for recreation. And I feel sorry for them. And
well, and erosion and sea level rise, they're not mutually exclusive. Could you talk a little bit how they kind of one impacts the other? Is there, so a hypothetical, is there an event where you could have a massive erosion event directly impact at the same time, let's say a hurricane's hitting, and then so an inland pond, because of that erosion, occurs more flooding? Okay.
This is something I'm particularly worried about for, say, Long Pond in particular.
Okay.
Long Pond is already tidal and connected to Nantucket Harbour via Nantucket Ditch. So there's a small tidal influence. Well, there is a tidal influence there. But Long Pond pretty much goes from the back end of Nantucket all the way north to within what, maybe half a mile, 3/4 of a mile, something like that, of the North Shore. And if that were to breach on the South Shore and become properly tidal for some length of time, one of the biggest assets we have on island is the town dump, the Nantucket landfill.
Okay.
Could you imagine if that became tidal and the edge of that landfill started eroding? Would we potentially mine out the landfill? Or how would we deal with it? Would we have to hard armor it? I don't really have a solution. And this is something that I know some of my committee members are particularly interested in. And it comes up in a lot of meetings. And they're right, it is a tragedy waiting to happen in some case. There's other things as well that could happen. Say if Long Pond did breach and become tidal in a storm event, we've already seen it, first and second bridge go. Nantucket people are cut off. But that's not the only part of the island. We've seen something similar happen on the Palpas Road at Folgers Marsh, where that culvert just becomes overwhelmed. It's a small bridge, becomes overwhelmed, and flood water covers the road and people are cut off. And if that happens during a freezing storm event and you can't drive Milestone Road, the people in Wawinnet, all the way down to the edge of Sacagawea Pond, name of the place, Quidnet, are isolated. So they're already isolated on an island, and then there's the potential for being isolated from town, where all the services are.
You raised some good points, Vince. But so we've, and to just to keep it segueing, we've talked about issues, and I know you've talked when we were first leading off with your initial taking of the position and kind of your role. Let's give the people some of the, and let's take it easy on Vince. He's only been in the job for so long. In terms of solutions, or ideas, if you will, that you've kind of highlighted some of the people that you work with other town organizations and committees, sort of the solutions, if you will.
Yeah. So when we talk about resilience, we talk about a resilience cycle. And the cycle is, just going to pop it up here. I just brought it up a second ago, so I made sure I'd have it. We always start by looking at the risk and the vulnerability of an area. Leads on to developing a plan and prioritizing aspects of that plan, implementation of the plan then at that point. Then you have to wait. Then there's going to be a hazard happens, catastrophic event, a storm usually, or a hurricane, or a nor'easter comes by, wreaks havoc, and then we get into the recovery phase. This can also be within the plan, and it's probably also within the remit of the town's emergency management coordinator within the police department. Then we come together again, we evaluate, well, what happened? What did we do to adapt our plan and fix the plan so that we can move on again. Then you're back into vulnerability and risk, and all of this just improves vulnerability, the risk assessment and the vulnerability. So this is a graph I show all the time. And it's wonderful. It's great to see a nice graph, but what we really kind of want to see is, well, what's a real adaptation strategy? So I talk an awful lot about just 3 basic adaptation strategies. So 2 of these are Nantucket examples, but the first one, accommodate, isn't. This is an example from Georgia, as far as I remember. This is just a dramatic photograph to show a house on stilts. This would never pass HDC here in Nantucket, but it's just a nice house on stilts. And that's what we call accommodate. We accommodate for floodwaters by going up or doing another type of accommodation method, but that's a simple one. We just elevate ourselves. Then we can also protect hard armor places. The middle photograph is from the North Shore here in Nantucket. This is from the Dionis area. The little beach in the middle is called Little Dionis, as far as I know. And the beach to the left is Dionis. But these 2 are 2 different types of hard armoring. The building on the left has a wooden bulkhead, and the building on the right has a rock revetment. They work, they do the job, has to be a pre-78 structure, as I understand, in order to be able to qualify for such things. So most of it is done at this point. But the real issue is there's problems associated with protecting an area. So the remainder of the beach around it has still eroded, whereas these have become kind of protrusions out into the sea. It's just an issue. Then the third method that third strategy we can deal with is retreat. So this is a photograph from Nantucket by Hummock Pond from the Toscana website, where Toscana are moving a house further back. They're retreating away from the shoreline. They're retreating from an erosion area. So we can retreat from a flood area as well. So it equally works in that respect. I could go and show lots of other methods, but just the basic strategies for adaptation, for resilience, is kind of what I wanted to cover here. There's no point going into an in-depth, detailed methodology of how you can do this, and I could take up another 2 hours and bore myself to tears. But we could also talk about one of my favorite things, green infrastructure. This is something I get excited about. So when I was talking about the bulkheads and revetments there, we also have bulkheads and and those kind of things in the downtown area. Take, for example, the Easy Street. There's a bulkhead there. It's wooden, but it's for wave attenuation. It's not to keep the sea out. It's to stop waves getting so high, but it's a nice, easy idea for a bulkhead. Other things you could talk, that's kind of traditional infrastructure.
Okay.
We may end up talking a lot about green infrastructure. What if we put a brand new salt marsh in that area, elevated it up a little bit, took a few years to develop it? That would create kind of a sponge. It would take all the energy out of waves that were coming in. It would hold out a lot of the water, as salt marshes tend to do. Salt marshes are natural sponges. Plus, we have a lot of wetlands on this island. Wetlands are really good, like inland wetlands, I mean, like freshwater ponds. They're really good for water retention. Why can't we just store some water there during a rainfall event, storm event, and then let it flow out afterwards? It really stops some of the flooding in the downtown areas. So you could turn what would have been 6 inches of water into 2 inches of water, and then you don't lose quite so much money. So that's an adaptation strategy.
Would you call that a sponge effect, if you will?
It's just water retention. I've never heard it called a sponge effect, but you could do it, I suppose. But that's the kind of green infrastructure thing that I like to talk about most, and soak away areas. That's this kind of stuff. But then there's kind of a middle ground. Gray infrastructure is what is commonly termed. It's usually an element of traditional infrastructure with a green infrastructure element incorporated. So sometimes what you might see is like a rock revetment, and then just above that there'll be an earth bank, and the whole earth bank or sand bank or whatever it might be, will just be planted with beach grass and other shrubs, just to hold that soil in place. And the two together become a type of grey infrastructure. There's potential we could do some of that in the downtown area, particularly in the Washington Street area.
Okay. Well, thank you, Vince. We're coming up on our Q&A session. Just real quickly, is there anything that if you were a concerned community member, that if they wanted to play a role, if they wanted to play their part, that they could play into helping in the efforts of coastal resiliency?
Definitely. There's a number of ways. So I'd always make the plug. Sadly, the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee, with the wonderful acronym CRAC, isn't meeting at the moment. But when we do meet, we meet publicly, and there's always going to be some public comment section, as there is with any town board or committee meeting. So I would always make a plug for that. But there's other groups around as well that, excuse me, such as the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. That's kind of an advocacy group of sorts. And I've also worked with them on I've worked with them on issues and helped them through things. And likewise, they've provided me with terrific information. They're another good local organization. And to be fair, this town works with local input, whether it's through a committee directly or through an advocacy group, keeping committees working and looking at options, providing options the town hasn't thought of or seen before, even better. So these committees do play a role, certainly. There's others. Must also make a mention for another project I'm working on. I sometimes have to draw myself back. I get quite excited about, doing a little bit of a development in a wetland area just to make an area more resilient. But this whole island is a historic landmark. And one of the projects I'm working on is Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation, to make old historic properties and pretty much the whole island, because the whole island is a historic landmark, more resilient to the effects of climate change, coastal resilience, sea level rise. But, and they're getting to point, organizations like PIN that support that project, Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation, they are also involved through Acclimate, which is working together with the consultant. And then there's one or two other organizations, NPT, Nantucket, oh dear, suddenly blanked on their name.
Oh, the Preservation Trust.
Thank you. Preservation Trust, they're also doing wonderful work, and we're working with them to some extent to get their message out to help preserve historic areas. And it's something that I'm always trying harder for myself to develop, because I tend to forget about the historic side of things. It's not mine alone. We have a historic preservation planner within the planning department, Holly Backus, and I have to give her a big shout out, work with her on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. She is the biggest advocate for historic need on this island there is, and it would fall apart without her, has to be said. But she's the backbone of that. But you've also got to recognize that there's, sorry, getting off on a small tangent now.
No, go ahead.
Just looking at the structure within the town, there's a handful of us that work together, kind of working on sustainability within the town. So I'm within this group, as is Holly. There's another gentleman, Chuck Larson, he's the special projects manager. Greg Tivnan, he's the assistant town manager and leads this sustainability group. We also have Lauren Sinatra, the energy coordinator. She comes at it from the other side, and she's working on a plan for climate adaptations separately, as far as I remember. I might have the wrong name on that. But she's working on a separate plan that will have segues and a lot of crossover with the coastal resilience plan. So I'll have to work with her in detail on that stuff. So that's kind of a basic structure. So the town has a resiliency working group, sorry, not resiliency, sustainability working group. And we're trying to find the best way to proceed, both a coastal resilience, historical resilience, climate adaptation, and we'll probably pick up a few more things along the way. One of the projects that I'm hoping might get more traction, because it's been topical of late, is the blanking on a name again. Sorry, been talking for.
No, your recall has been impressive, Vince.
Yeah,
you're doing good.
Supply chain analysis. We're trying to see what our supply chains are like. They have been tested as part of this COVID issue, and we've now seen where the weaknesses are. But we can use that. We can see if in a storm event we've already known that milk and veg run out in Stop and Shop pretty quickly. let's see now, well, how can we improve it? How can we make the system better? So this is another side project related to resilience that I'm becoming somewhat more involved in.
Okay. Well, real quick, off that note, any last second plugs, any other groups, names, initiatives, side projects? I know it's that time of year for you as well with the birds and things of that nature. Do you want to plug real quick before we get to Q&A?
Yeah, just to explain the birds quickly. My previous job was the protected species technician for the town before I took up this role. Sadly, with a hiring freeze in place, there's a few of us in the department, including people who have never done bird work before, including Thais Fournier, who's our water quality specialist, who's now doing a little bit of bird work with me and has been brilliant. So I'm having to pick up part of my old job, but real focus is on the resilience work.
Of course.
Also a shout out to the Coast Resiliency Advisory Committee again. They have been brilliant. They have worked very hard amongst themselves to keep me on the straight and narrow. Let's face that fact. Then the Natural Resources Department, have to mention Jeff Carlson. He's my boss, my supervisor, one of the nicest guys around. Have to say hi to him. Oh yeah, and of course, thank you to Holly. Have to always say thank you to Holly.
And I am going to go ahead and open up to our Q&A, folks. I noticed some of you are still using the chat. Any questions towards Vince? Use that down on your taskbar that says Q&A. It'll bring up a dialog box, and just type your question there and it'll queue it for us to read off. So let's just go ahead and get it going here. I do have a couple in front of me. The first one being from Scott Rowe. Scott asks, what is the most impacted area on the island? Either the coastal erosion, for example, Skankity Bluff, or the impact on the overall ecosystems in the harbor, inland waterways, or something else altogether. Yeah. So kind of, what would you say is the most impacted area out of all those?
That's a tough one. It really is. In terms of erosion, there's a couple of real hotspots. Sankety Bluff is up there. Sconset Bluff is up there. Nantucket is hands down suffering, linear-wise, some of the worst erosion. But anywhere in the South Shore is just suffering a lot of erosion. In terms of flooding, again, Nantucket takes a lot of flooding. Downtown area, I'd hate to think what it costs, and I don't think there's ever been a real analysis of what it's cost. So that's something to be kind of curious about. Yeah, there's a couple of hotspots for flooding. Pocomo, not Pocomo, the road at Folgers Marsh, and then at not Pocomo, but inside it, the Pulpus Harbour. Pulpus Harbour also gets quite flooding. The inner harbour is more protected from erosion, but then they get the flooding impact, and the flooding can be just as equally as damaging and financially costly. Erosion, moving houses, that's always expensive. Moving houses in expensive areas when you've got a large house, say for the sake of argument, Sconset Bluff, trying to retreat a house there, that's not going to be easy or cheap. Plus, where do you put it? Can you find a piece of property to put your house on? It's always an issue. And this is, Sconset Bluff is one of the things that the CONCOM has dealt with mostly with. And it is an interesting project. And once it's with the CONCOM, I'm just going to try and leave it there and know that it is always a method that has been used on island.
Okay, great. So keep it moving here. We an anonymous question here. What are the potential roles for state or federal authorities for assisting Nantucket efforts in this area?
Okay, that's a good question. So we already have, at the moment even, a couple of grant applications we're working on for state ones, state grants. One is an MVP grant because we're an MVP community. Municipal vulnerability preparedness. It was something that Chuck and Holly worked on extensively last year. And in April of 2019, we became an MVP community. That allows you to apply for MVP grants.
Can you, what was MVP for again? I'm sorry.
Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness. Okay. It's a state-run program. And we're hopefully going to be putting in an application for that. There's another state organization called CZM, Coastal Zone Management. We're going to be putting in an application for that as well as a town. I'm not sure I'm going to be directly involved in that one, but I will to some extent be involved. And so we're always trying to apply for grant money to make this less of a burden financially on the community. And they're usually matching grants. So the town has to supply a portion either financially or in-kind services. It's usually in the ballpark of 25%. So if we can say supply staff time to make it cheaper and then lessen the town's financial contribution, that works. There are some federal funds we are also eligible to apply for, sometimes through Fema. So we'll apply for what we can, lessen the labor and lessen the impact on the town's budget, particularly in the coming year when it looks like there might be a minor recession or probably major recession on the way.
Yeah, well, on that one, we'll keep it moving on that one. So the next question is really going back to sea level rise, and just they ask, what projection regarding sea level rise is the CRAC using? So the CRAC being the committee you referenced earlier, is using for its planning. So what projection model is CRAC using for its plannings? The projections have risen over recent years from 2 feet by 2021 up to 10 feet. So 2 feet by year 2100 up to 10 feet. So in other words, the projections have changed, and they said this makes a huge difference.
And they're constantly being updated. Up until around Christmas, I was using somewhat slightly older data. That's partly my fault, and then I found newer data. Always go with the newest and best, but it has to be quality data. So I've been using state level data from the Massachusetts Greater Basin Report, and that was using one set of projections. Now I'm using NOAA data specifically for Nantucket, developed using the Nantucket tide gauge. It was information that was developed in 2017 and released, I think, in 2018 or 19. Had a slow start. In fact, some of the images I was showing you, like the tides, the high tide flooding, come from the NOAA website. And on the same map viewer, you can look at the different sea level rise projections, and they kind of are based on two things. They're based on time, so they're usually in 10-year increments, kind of from 2000, 2010, 2020, up to 2100. So we've only got about 80 years left on these projections. And then the other variable that you have to take into account is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in these. So under an intermediate scenario, for the sake of argument, which is what most people tend to use, intermediate or intermediate high, just for kind of more normalized central data, it uses one level of CO2 going to the atmosphere at about close to current rate, and not increasing a great deal. However, if our CO2 emissions go crazy and we get into the high scenarios, that's when you might see upwards of, I think for Nantucket, I think the high is 11 or just shy of 11 feet for 2100. But that is in the high scenario, and that is outside. It's in the 1 percentile type scenario. It's not likely, but our energy usage and carbon emissions would have to go through the roof for that to happen. So people tend to use more middle of the road data. So what they're saying for Nantucket, as a more realistic estimate, and this is kind of ballpark even at that, by 2100, they're looking at 4 to 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. But even within the data from NOAA, the first 30 years of that, from 2020 to 2050, there's a certain high level of accuracy. Once you get beyond 2050 and going towards 2080, you lose resolution and it becomes a bit more fuzzy. 2100, kind of, you're not guessing, it is based on numbers, but it becomes less predictable, less accurate, I suppose is a better way of putting it. But it is based on a hell of a lot of research. But even looking at Nantucket between 2020 now and looking at it towards 2050, we're still looking at, shy of a foot of sea level rise potentially. And that's under an intermediate scenario. That's still not good.
No, no, it's not. I do have another question here, kind of general. Just to talk about the Sconset area, if you could, and but anything that you can think of that would pertain to Sconset and kind of.
So Sconset, there's a couple of big issues with Sconset. So there's we'll start with the big one, the Sconset Bluff Preservation Fund, the SBPF project. I'm only going to give an outline of it. I'm not going to give a judgment because that's not for me to do. This is within the CONCOM's realm, and it's for the CONCOM to work on. Effectively, just the project is currently a 900-foot set of 3 geotubes at the base of Sconset Bluff. The idea being to slow or stop erosion, to stop Baxter Road falling into the sea and therefore cutting people off further down the road and losing access, and all the services that are within the road, like fire hydrants, water for houses, and I don't know if the sewers, I think most of the houses there are in septic, but the point is the services in the road, electricity, all that kind of stuff, internet, we have to consider. So yeah, that is one problem. It is a private project on a public beach that was done through agreement with the town. It is, I've always just said, it is a method that is used on island. I would really not like to get into the politics of it because that is for another organization, for the CONCOM to deal with, and they are dealing with it. And I hopefully they're dealing with it quite well, but everyone to their own opinion. Other issues with Sconset. There's a set of houses. Oh, what's that road called? Is it Gully Road? Just
I'm not sure.
Park. And those houses are quite low down. There's potential that they could get flooded in storms. I think some of them might be in a Fema flood zone, so that's always a problem. One of the issues in Sconset that I've been monitoring a hell of a lot of late is down at the old sewer beds in Sconset. There's been an enormous erosion event. I started monitoring it in September, and the area had never been particularly stable. Roughly speaking, back of an envelope calculation, it's lost about 140 feet of sea frontage since September, and it happened in a small event in September, a dreadful event in February, and another dreadful event in March. And it lost a hell of a lot of land. It's now getting close to where the old sewer beds are. And that's still an area that's maintained by the sewer department. So I've been in contact and working a little bit with the sewer department, but they're the ones that are leading the efforts there. But it's something that I've been monitoring just as a tremendous erosion area. It is frightening how fast that was lost. And it is way outside the state's projections for the area. But these things happen.
Yeah, this is true. Okay, everybody, are there any other questions? We're coming up on 8 o'clock. Again, that Q&A box down below, if you had any other questions for Vince. If not.
There's just one just popped up.
Okay. Here.
Row. Are there areas on island where the erosion, soils, minerals are being deposited? Deposition. So we've had a lot of erosion. So there are some areas of mild accretion. And Co2 has some areas that are gaining sand. 1 or 2 areas around Eel Point are gaining sand, but not at terribly fast rates. Some of them are only about plus 0.2 feet per year. Others are closer to a foot, but it just, when you're talking in decimals of a foot, you're not talking major gains. Anywhere on the south and east facing shores are not really gaining much. Almost all of those areas are losing sand, in fact. Even the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at things are in Sacajah Pond, and that is losing sand faster than I would have anticipated. But that might be a localized event and might gain sand back again, but it's not going to be gained in a cumulative way that would make a difference to actively buffer the area from a coastal impact.
So we got another one from Lynn here. Coming from Florida, I wonder if erosion is occurring there. no worries if it's too off topic. So just kind of, and off that note, not only Florida, real quick, around the country, so some other communities of interest, if you will.
Sure. So I have specialized in Nantucket. I don't really know what's going on.
Of course.
Watched one or two documentaries that said we're talking about high tide flooding in Florida. Know nothing about erosion down there, but I just know that they had a particular type of calcareous soil. Calcium carbonate effectively dissolves in weakly acidic water, leads to a lot of underwelling of water, comes up under houses. I basically know the mechanics of it. I don't know anything about it. And all I can do, I can't even name the place. I don't know hardly anything about it.
Great. And if that no one else, last but not least, and I bet you could guess who this came from, an anonymous attendee, what is your astrology sign?
Yeah, that question's been sitting there for a while, hasn't it? Yeah. So don't believe in any of that stuff. Sorry, that's just not my cup of tea. And tea other than coffee. That's about as much as I would say on that one.
Okay. All right, Vince. Well, on behalf of the Athenaeum, I want to thank you for your time. And everybody in attendance, thank you for coming out to our first Nantucket Perspective series. We hope for it to be a bi-weekly series. Stay tuned to the Nantucket website just to gather information on that. Anytime you want to reach out to someone regarding that programs, either me, Daniel Griffin, of course, Janet Forrest, and our fearless leader, Amy Janess. And Vince, thank you. Thank you to the Natural Resources Department in the town of Nantucket for all the work and all the associated communities. And yeah, it was a good combo. And thank you again. Hope to talk to you soon.
Absolute pleasure. Let's deal with some questions.
All right. Take care, guys.